Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 35 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, for this series, we're going to be spending time looking at the Inklings. And we started last week by looking at Humphrey Carpenter's excellent book, The Inklings. It was first published in 1978. That's the year after Carpenter's biography on Tolkien, but 3 years before he and Christopher Tolkien collaborated on the letters. Let's pick up where we left off last time when Tolkien told Lewis that he abominated liberal studies. Carpenter explains that there were a few reasons for this. Some of this attitude was because Tolkien had himself not really studied literature after Chaucer, because at his old school, King Edward's in Birmingham, it really hadn't been taught, and because, as we know, he concentrated on the language side of English as an undergrad. But it's also because he was a bit of an iconoclast. Carpenter writes that Tolkien took an impish delight in challenging established values, saying that he found the Fairy Queen unreadable because of Spenser's idiosyncratic treatment of the language, and declaring that Shakespeare had been unjustifiably deified. There was a much bigger and more central reason, as Carpenter writes. His own mind and imagination had been captivated since school days by early English poems, such as Beowulf, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and Pearl, and by the Old Icelandic Volsungasaga and Elder Edda. These were all the literature that he needed. But not to his friend and soon-to-be fellow Inkling, C.S. Lewis. Spenser was actually one of his favorites. Lewis didn't know much Anglo-Saxon in comparison to Tolkien, though, to be fair, that's a pretty high bar. I'm not sure how many of us would actually know much Anglo-Saxon compared to Tolkien. And though Lewis was himself deeply attached to Norse mythology, he knew very little of the Old Icelandic language itself. So Tolkien's argument that the language is the real thing seemed like a bit of an exaggeration to Lewis. Still, the things that Tolkien wanted to change in the syllabus made sense. As Carpenter writes, at that time, the Oxford syllabus was, in his view, gravely deficient in that it did not encourage a literary approach to early and medieval writings. And Tolkien did believe passionately that Anglo-Saxon and Middle English prose and poetry should be treated as literature, and not merely as a quarry for passages set in examinations and for teaching the rules of sound changes. He was bothered by the fact that the students had to learn rules by rote, but that they didn't learn the literature that these rules came from and were applied to. Now, Lewis himself had come to realize, says Carpenter, the absurdity of this situation, hence his Beer and Beowulf evenings, in which his pupils actually did some reading beyond the syllabus. Wait a minute now, Beer and Beowulf? I mean, where do we all sign up for this class, right? Hanging in a pub with C.S. Lewis, reading the Old English epic? Well, it turns out that as a tutor at Magdalen, Carpenter writes, Lewis, who was going to be responsible for teaching his pupils the whole English school syllabus from the Battle of Malden to Blake, had decided to do his best to make the early part of the course palatable by organizing evenings of Beer and Beowulf, and by inventing mnemonics to teach his pupils the laws of sound changes. All right, where do I sign? I mean, what a class, right? Still, let's get back to that lit-lang debate, though. It turns out that things weren't a whole lot better even for those students who chose to study early and medieval English. Carpenter writes that they had to spend a good deal of time, wasted time, thought Tolkien, away from their special field, reading Shakespeare and Milton. Tolkien was determined to end this, and to get the faculty to accept a remodeled syllabus in which everyone would be expected to read widely in early English literature, while the early and medieval specialists could pursue their chosen work without having to turn aside and study later writers. Well, it makes good sense to me. And in fact, few of the faculty members had issues with these ideas in general. The problem was that making room for the early period of literature meant removing, or at least making optional, other parts of the syllabus. In an article in the Oxford magazine, Tolkien suggested getting rid of the 19th century, and according to Carpenter, suggested that the compulsory papers should stop at 1830. Now, believe it or not, this idea, increasing the study of ancient literature at the cost of cutting back on modern writers, was actually appealing to the faculty. After all, these undergrads were perfectly capable of reading modern English literature without the help of the professors. As Carpenter writes, the study of recent writers was particularly open to this charge, so there was some attraction in amputating the 19th century from the syllabus, particularly if it was to give place to what was indubitably a more scholarly pursuit in Oxford's eyes, the reading of Anglo-Saxon and Middle English. This is perhaps why, though Tolkien's proposal to finish the syllabus at 1830 was strongly resisted by many of the literature dons, it was not quashed, but became the subject of considerable argument in the English faculty during the months following Tolkien's first meeting with Lewis. Years, indeed, rather than months, for it was not until 1931 that the issue was settled. In large part because Lewis would eventually come around to Tolkien's side, which in itself is due, at least to some extent, to a club formed by Tolkien to read Icelandic sagas. And we're going to read about them next week. Now, folks, that wraps it up for this week's Tolkien Tuesday. But please join me again next week as we learn more about the men who lounge so close to the fire in winter that they bite the coal. And please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join my content council, get a bonus episode every week, and more. And then join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, you know the drill. Like and subscribe. And please follow or subscribe if you're listening to it on a podcast app. And follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.